to discuss the challenges that have existed in enriching gender parity, equity, and empowerment for women and girls around the world, especially in Africa, we are pleased to have Sarah Hendriks, UN Women Deputy Executive Director for Programs, from our VOA studios at the United Nations in New York. We're going to go right into the report that's coming out this week ahead of the 50th anniversary for Women's Day, March 8th. And this report, The Women's Right in Review, 30 Years After Beijing. Can you tell us a little bit about what's in the report?
Yeah, this report, 30 Years in Review, Women's Rights After Beijing, really tells us that progress has been made, that in fact around the world, gender equality is made great gains, whether that's in the reductions in maternal mortality or in the fact that there are more girls who've completed education today than any other point in history. But it also tells us that that progress has been far too slow, far too uneven, and in fact is right now under threat.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Hendriks, I also believe women have made gains over the last 3 decades, but gender discrimination is still embedded in many societies. So can you tell us why it's so hard to, to achieve gender equality?
You know, I think there are many headwinds that create the conditions for gender equality to be challenging to achieve around the world. And let's break this down perhaps into very concrete realities. Number one, when we just look at women's leadership, there are very many gains that have been made for women in parliaments right around the world. And yet, 3/4 of parliaments across the world are still dominated by men. What this means is that women don't have the opportunity to define the laws and policies that reflect their lives, that reflect their priorities. When we look at the African continent, about 15 countries, and only 15 countries, have actually reached the 30% target of having women in parliaments. We do know, however, that there are great spotlights. Rwanda is one of them, where 64% of Rwanda's parliaments have actually been taken by women. Secondly, I think it's important to look at girls' education. We know that girls' education matters to the trajectory for girls and women's entire lives. And we also know that gender parity has been achieved right around the world. Mm-hmm. And yet we also see that far too many girls are still left out of school. Part of the reason why girls across the continent don't finish secondary education is because of things like child early and forced marriage. In fact, nearly 40% of girls across the continent are married as children, where they don't get to decide who or when or if they get married. And this often holds them back from greater opportunities in life, defining the trajectory of their life while they're still a girl.
Some countries have reached 30%, even though some, like Rwanda, you've made a point that 60% have gained ground. But, some would argue maybe they don't have really political power to make decisions. But many countries have reached 30% at least. Some would argue that that is only where the law will allow them to go. They have not really gone further than that. And that means that women are really stagnated because of how much power they're allowed to gain and stay there. What do you say about that?
I think you're right. I think what we've seen is that temporary special measures, or what are called quotas, have actually been very catalytic to opening the spaces for women to step into positions of power, to step into decision-making authority, to step into and be represented in parliaments and also in local governments. But in far too many countries, we haven't seen women be able to break through that ceiling beyond what the law allows. And part of that is due to the ways in which women are still perceived, the ways in which social norms operate in homes, in communities, in countries and societies, in ways in which that translates to holding women and girls back.